Today, I am going to talk about loot for adventurers. I'm going to talk about the idea that loot is possibly the first or one of the first works of a new art form, and that art form is called emergent art. So, I'll introduce kind of a little short history of loot, and then I'll talk about what emergent art is, and then I'll talk about how emergent art gives us a kind of fresh perspective on what art itself is. So, this is obviously a pretty big topic, and I think it's something that people will be thinking about and writing about for a long time because I believe that loot is one of the most significant works of art that has happened in the last few decades. So I usually start this presentation by talking about, I should introduce myself. I am a kind of coalition of identities. I guess we are that coalition. I'm speaking with the voice of Glosso K, and I'm channeling the spirit of Aya K. And I don't have my avatar yet, but in my imagination, I'm wearing my M-Loot bag with these keys. Great. So let us jump into the loot first, shall we? So I usually start this presentation by talking about film. That film was this kind of like brand new medium when it came out, and like any new medium, it took a very long time for people to discover what you can do with a movie camera that you can't really do with any other medium. And the first movies are all super gimmicky and kind of silly until filmmakers start to realize that you can splice one image after another. And it's in this kind of quantum leap of discovering the narrative potential of the cut, as Stanley Kubrick put it, the only thing unique to film, that filmmaking turns into its own mature art form that we know and love today. I then make kind of the comparison to where we've been with art on the blockchain. A lot of it has been interesting, but for the most part, it's been kind of awkward and gimmicky. It's been borrowing from previous art forms, right? It's like, maybe NFTs are like digital art, like a painting, or maybe they're like a token membership to an online community. And we've had a lot of this phase, and hopefully it's starting to pass. Because similar to how the cut unlocked the art form of film, loot for adventurers seem to discover something that you can do on the blockchain that you can't really do with any other art form. So for those of you that aren't familiar, loot dropped in August of 2021, and it blew a lot of people's minds because it kind of defied many of the previous NFTs to date. And it was this thing that you couldn't actually define as kind of a digital art JPEG or a membership to a country club. It was this thing that actually resisted all definition. And the moment loot dropped, something kind of magical happened. These lists of items Dom Hoffman posted, as I'm sure many of us remember, kind of came to light, and very quickly a bunch of people started to build other loot projects, right? So the first items drop, and they seem to suggest that there could be this broader loot universe, but all there were just these lists of items. And then all of a sudden, folks like the Realms team look at these items and they say, well, if these items belong to this universe that was called loot, there must have been land in this world. And they build Realms, the land of the lootverse. And then another team comes along and goes, well, if there are items and there are land in this universe, then there must have been a currency that these people used. And the Adventure Gold token was born. And then folks go, wait, well, hold on. If there are items and land and a currency, then there must have been like people that owned these items, and so on and so forth. The kind of visual side of loot starts to emerge. And over the last 11 months, we've seen this enormous kind of network artwork emerge totally from the bottom up, just from these lists of items. Very much the same way that DeFi protocols create this surface area for other protocols to come in and plug in and build this thing from the bottom up. So loot, since its drop, and for the last 11 months, baffled people because you can't really describe it using any of our existing language for talking about art. It is a kind of massively multiplayer online game, but it's not just that. It's also a decentralized story. It's also this big fan fiction universe. It's also kind of an interactive fiction. It's also this community artwork and this participatory artwork, but it's more than all of those things. In fact, loot kind of bundles every art form ever, because any project can kind of come in and build the loot dance project, or they can build loot music projects, or they can build loot painting projects, or they can build loot video game projects. So this has been a kind of large question that the community has been asking. It's like, if loot is all of these art forms, and if loot also has this whole kind of infrastructure of funding and kind of democratic organization, what the hell is loot? So it's only in very recent times that we have started to kind of develop a language for talking about this thing called loot. That is the idea of loot as this emergent artwork. So if we want to kind of understand loot as this emergent artwork, the best place we can look is this thing that the community calls the primitive. Because I do believe, to kind of draw back to my analogy with film, if the cut in film is the thing that kind of helps the art form of film kind of be born from the technology of the motion picture camera, it's these things called primitives that really make loot something quite special. So, what is the primitive? It's a pretty big question, and it's a kind of practice of building these primitives that is super young, and has a really young language to talk about primitives. And there are a few artists that are kind of pioneering the practice of building these things. So to talk about a primitive is kind of a large task, and I only have like 10 minutes at this point, so I'll try and keep it short. But the notion of a primitive is something that is common to a lot of disciplines. And philosophy has this idea of primitive notions, and math, primitive functions, computation, primitive data types, and linguistics, word roots, and biology, a primitive streak. And basically in all of these various disciplines, and in the context of loot, the primitives are kind of like the original kind of primordial elements from which a much more kind of complex whole emerges, right? So in linguistics, the word roots are the kind of first sound unit from which all these other words are derived in this like long lineage. And in the case of loot, the primitives are the original items, metadata, from which the whole loot verse emerges. So here's another way of thinking about them. You can, as a kind of thought experiment, turn a bunch of different kind of universes into their original primordial element. So you could, as a thought experiment, think of hip hop, its primitives as rhyme speech over breakbeats. From that, the hip hop sound and musical style emerges. Or the Big Bang has, matter, antimatter, hydrogen, and helium. Or the Christian universe has these original elements of heaven, earth, and light. And from those original elements, an enormous complex universe emerges with layer and layer and layer of increasing complexity. So building emergent art primitives within the loot community, and people are starting to do it outside of the loot community, is very much this practice of kind of discovering these things that have this quality of being primal and arranging them in a very specific way. So the question that people usually have at that point is like, well, why, right? Like, how can a list of items be of interest of anybody? Like, why the hell could a universe emerge from just these lines of text? And this gets into the kind of unique aesthetic experience of loot. And it's in kind of diving into this aesthetic experience from loot that you can start to see how this new art form is special and different. So this is what folks call the magic of deriving. Because when these original loot bags came out, people started to kind of, well, dive into what the hell was going on here. And they started to derive all of these patterns, right? They looked into the prefixes and suffixes and gone, oh my gosh, well, there appears to be actually like a rating of these items that you can actually put on a scale of ones that are more powerful and ones that are less powerful. If you actually look at it into a closer too, you can see that it appears that there are different types of characters that carry these items, along with their different levels of power. There are warrior classes of characters and hunter classes of characters and mage classes of characters. Then if you look even closer, you can find all of the items that belong to each of those character classifications. And if you look at the suffixes, you can see that it appears that there is different orders of this loot universe, 16 of them, in fact, that come more and more with different attunement, whether it be light or dark. And they look even more and they say, oh my gosh, well, look, if you look at the prefixes and suffixes, you can start to see these different classes of lore emerge, along with hidden inside the contracts, but not shown on the JPEGs. These different items that don't actually appear, like kind of a lost bag of 17 different items. And this process is a very different relationship with an artistic object, because the people that came to these loot contracts were more like archaeologists. They dig apart for all of these different clues and develop this interpretation of the nature of the loot cosmos. This is a very powerful experience because it's one that has put people into these fits of obsession, because the closer you dig into a primitive, the more you start to have visions of what the lootverse can and should be. So the Hyperloot team digs through the loot contract primitives and has this vision of, oh my gosh, what did these characters look like? And from that, they derive the Hyperloot project, and that Hyperloot project has flourished into this game and these card games and etc. Right? The Realms team looks into the project and goes, well, what? There must have been land where these items lived. And that is turning into a massively multiplayer online game. Foolish Swami stares into the Genesis Adventurer primitive, which is a primitive built on top of the original primitive, and derives a vision of a villain of the lootverse. And then folks go into that derivation and start to write stories about this villain and stories on the stories of the villain, and then music videos and songs for this villain, and then 3D helms for this villain, right? Or, Three-Wave gets an image of the crypts and caverns of this world, and that starts to fork not just to MMOs, but also outside of the lootverse. And you can start to kind of see how the community kind of builds itself from the bottom up, and how this whole world can kind of add layer and layer of emergent complexity from this very personal process of deriving your vision of the lootverse. So the same way you can go from atoms to a city, you can go from lines of text to more primitives, to economic infrastructure, to a visualization layer, to another layer of artworks, all the way to these massive multiplayer virtual online worlds. And this is a deeply, deeply personal relationship with a primitive, because any single person is going to have a different vision of what loot is. And they're going to visualize that in, their unique way. So once you start to dive into this practice of building primitives and the unique relationship that people in the loot community have with these primitives, you can start to understand that emergent art, and loot being one of the first emergent artworks, is not just a new art form, but also offers us a different idea of what an artwork can be and what art itself can be. I'll end with this. So this is how most people think about what art is. People think art is this thing that you spectate, right? Picasso shows a painting and the audience takes in the painting. And the art is successful if it rouses your soul and moves you. And the idea of what art is very simple. It's the thing that this artist built from the top down. Mediums like this are like painting, recorded music, novels, film. They all have this relationship. Other people think that art is this thing that you participate in. And if it's successful, if it rouses your soul to build something within it, right? Where, the Minecraft creator creates Minecraft and people in the audience build stuff within Minecraft. Or so-and-so makes a TikTok and you're aroused to make your own version of that TikTok. And this is a very popular idea of art that arose in the 20th century, that art is actually not just the thing that the artist built, but it's kind of the gray space in between the artwork and the audience. This is where loot gives us a different idea, and emergent art gives us a different idea. Because it's not whether the part or the artwork rouses your soul to build something within it. It's more so a question of, does the part rouse your soul to build the emergent whole, the lootverse itself? And this is the relationship. Dom, the guy that made the first OG loot bags, makes these loot bags. Those loot bags go to the loot audience. But there really is nothing to spectate with them. There's no platform for you to use them. You actually are more so struck from that act of deriving with a vision of what the lootverse is. And maybe you tweak that, or you make your own derivative loot project, and you in turn become the artist. And you make more of these artworks, and those artworks go to more of an audience, and kind of slowly but surely this ecosystem can build itself from the bottom up on this totally egalitarian plane. And that's in that sense that this massive artwork as collective intelligence, this artwork as a network artwork, this artwork as a social technology can emerge. And that whole relationship, the artist emerging from the primitive, the audience emerging from the primitives, the artwork things they build emerging from the primitives, the whole goddamn thing, that's the idea of what the emergent artwork is, and that's the idea of what art can be. The whole goddamn universal democratic artwork governed by the people of the lootverse. And that's the basic idea of emergent art. It's building primitives to grow an art-making community, and the artwork is the community and everything they make.